Hi, everyone. It's been about 2 minutes, so I think it's time to get started. My name is Jennifer Calais. I'm from Synapse Energy Economics, and I want to welcome you to our third Thursday webinar series. Our July webinar is called Storming Ahead, FERC and the State Efforts to Enhance Reliability and Resiliency. I'll be moderating today. We have two panelists with us, Paul Peterson and Max Chang, both from Synapse Energy Economics. And Synapse is a research and consulting firm. We specialize in energy, economic, and environmental topics. We provide a number of services from analyses to regulatory support, writing, policy analyses, and also for a number of different types of clients, various stakeholder committees, and government and public interest clients. We have a website, www.synapse-energy.com, and you can find a number of non-confidential publications and open source tools there, so we hope you'll check it out. So what we're going to do in terms of order is Paul is going to go first. He's going to talk about recent FERC orders and do some assessment of those, and then we'll follow with Max, who is going to talk about New Jersey resiliency response post a few major events. But before we get started, I just want to go over a few logistics so everyone's clear on how we're going to proceed. So I want to let everybody know that this webinar is being recorded. We will circulate it in the next day or so after this webinar closes to all the attendees, along with slides. All of the attendees on this webinar, we've muted you, and we'll keep you muted throughout the webinar. We, however, would love to hear your questions, and please send them along to us. You don't need to wait till the end to send them. Please send them as soon as you think of them. You can send them to webinar@synapse-energy.com. And we will have a Q&A session at the end where the panelists will answer the questions that we've received during the course of the webinar. If you are having any technical issues with either the WebEx software or your audio, please use the chat feature. And we will work with you to resolve that in real time during the course of the webinar. And with all of that, I think we can move on to get started. I'm going to turn it over to Paul to present his section on recent FERC orders. So take it away, Paul. Thank you. Paul, are you there? We can't hear you.
How's it? Is that better?
That's much better. Thank you very much.
Okay, sorry about that. Good morning, good afternoon to everyone on the phone. My name's Paul Peterson. I'm going to be doing the first presentation, and it's really kind of a story that I'm going to tell, and then I'm going to pose some questions at the end as to what this story might mean. We're going to look at, very briefly, at a sequence of events, starting with the Department of Energy's request to FERC last summer to do a proposed rulemaking to develop rules to retain resources needed for resiliency and or reliability. Then we're going to move on to what FERC did with that request, and then we'll look at two recent orders, June 29th, the FERC order regarding the PJM interconnection, and a July 2nd FERC order for ISO New England. And we'll finish up with some questions, thoughts about what all this language from the FERC might mean. So in September of 29, DOE, Department of Energy, requested the FERC to approve an emergency rule to retain resources. It was widely interpreted that these resources would be fuel, secure resources that had fuel available 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. And FERC received hundreds of filings over this with a lot of stakeholders concerned about what the resilience definition and what the means in terms of electric grid reliability. It's kind of a new term that has come up. There were many proposals that were made to FERC, including some that requested FERC to take certain immediate actions, to institute specific market designs in particular regions, to initiate technical conferences, and some even had specific RTO by RTO requests as to types of solutions that were being requested through this resiliency reliability docket. In January, FERC decided to terminate the request for a rulemaking, basically without prejudice. It could be brought back at a later time. And they said that a definition of resilience in regard to electric grid reliability needed to be developed, and that based on the current record before it, it had no basis to approve the rule, so therefore they would terminate it, but at the same time open a new proceeding, a FERC docket, administrative docket, that according to the notice that FERC provided would holistically examine the resilience of the bulk power system. In order to develop a record, FERC directed ISOs and RTOs to make filings within 60 days of the January 8th order. They all complied and made numerous filings. And then stakeholders were invited to respond to those filings, and hundreds of stakeholders did respond to those filings. Again, similar to the request for the rulemaking docket, there were a lot of requests presented in AD 18-7 for immediate compensation for specific resources. Coal and nuclear were prominently mentioned in many of the filings. Several other commentators suggested FERC should order specific remedies, such as new gas pipelines in the Northeast, both in New York and in parts of New England. A lot of other commentators said we need a more thorough investigation into what exactly is meant by resiliency and reliability. How are they the same, or how are they different, and what does it mean for electric power grids to be both reliable and resilient? Many other comments focused on the basic tension that generated a lot of this issue between fuel-neutral wholesale markets, those are markets that select resources based on lowest bid price into the marketplace, and state policies and programs that are popping up all over the country that seem to favor specific resources. Now let's fast forward from all this activity back in January, February, March, April, May. Concurrent with those AD 18-7 filings, PJM had proposed changes to its capacity market design to try to address the impact of state-supported resources on the wholesale markets. These subsidized resources took many forms, different kinds. There are nuclear plants in Illinois, renewable resources throughout the PJM footprint, and a lot of coal plants in the Midwest. All of these resources were either already had available certain supplemental incomes, or in the process of going through state proceedings to receive supplemental income. On June 29th, the FERC rejected PJM's proposed tariff changes and found that PJM's capacity market was not just and reasonable, and it was unduly discriminatory. This is a real touchstone of FERC regulation. Everything must be just and reasonable and not unduly discriminatory, or it's not allowed to be implemented. So in the process of rejecting the tariff changes, FERC opened a new proceeding for a paper hearing on necessary PJM tariff changes to address the issues identified in PJM's filings. That order specifically directed PJM to institute a minimum offer price rule for all resources. Currently, only gas-fired resources in PJM are subject to a minimum offer price rule when they offer into their capacity market. FERC also directed PJM to consider a fixed resource requirement alternative. This builds off of an existing policy within PJM called fixed resource requirement, which has been available to load-serving entities or utilities on a comprehensive basis. In other words, a market participant could choose to entirely opt out of the PJM capacity market, and its load would not be counted in the calculation of the market clearing mechanism also. What FERC directed PJM to do on June 29th was to develop a similar mechanism, not the same mechanism, but a similar mechanism called a fixed resource requirement alternative that would allow individual resources to opt out of the capacity market along with a commensurate amount of load. Now shifting to ISO New England, Also concurrent with their filings in AD 18-7 on resiliency and reliability, ISO New England requested a waiver of its tariff to allow ISO New England to retain a specific generation unit called Mystic Station with a 2-year cost of service agreement. ISO New England stated in their filing that Mystic was needed for the winter fuel security. ISO New England also proposed to file tariff changes by November to accommodate any future such requests. Other resources similarly situated to Mystic that might want to exit the market, and if ISO New England found that they were needed, ISO New England would develop a cost of service agreement to retain those resources. On July 2nd, a few days after the PJM order, the FERC rejected ISO New England's waiver request and directed ISO New England within 60 days to demonstrate whether its tariff was just and reasonable and not unduly discriminatory, or file the changes necessary to make it so. Now, it's interesting that with the PJM record, they actually found PJM's tariff was unjust and unreasonable. In the ISO New England case, they said they didn't have evidence to determine one way or the other, and ISO New England was put on a 60-day clock to demonstrate either that they could show that the tariff was just and reasonable or file necessary changes to make it just and reasonable. And they opened a new docket to consider any of those tariff changes. ISO New England has already stated that it will not try to defend its current tariff as just and reasonable, but will file tariff changes by August 31st that will define what a fuel security reliability risk is, evaluate any requests made by generation resources that seek retirement where there's a fuel security question. They'll use a winter reliability model that the ISO has developed to determine whether or not there's a winter fuel security reliability risk. And they will incorporate any compensation agreements necessary to keep a unit around into its wholesale market changes. The compensation mechanism for Mystic Station will continue in a separate proceeding on an accelerated schedule. The anticipated retirement action would occur in FTA 13, which takes place in February of 2019. I'm not sure how familiar people are with the way forward capacity markets work, but they operate on a 3-year forward schedule. So next February 2019, the auction for resources 3 years into the future will be conducted, and that's when Mystic Station is seeking to retire 3 years into the future. ISO New England was also told by FERC to file tariff changes by July 2019 for new markets or market products that will eliminate the need to retain resources for fuel security reliability. So there's a lot packed into that FERC order of July 2nd. It's a very interesting order. It covers a lot of ground. So now we get to what is the import of all these FERC actions. And there are a lot of, I present these as questions. It's really a question of trying to read the tea leaves. What is it that is in these orders that may give us some information going forward? And I think one of the first questions is it appears FERC is ready to move forward on resiliency reliability issues without waiting for proceedings at AD 18-7 to conclude. There's no firm date for when those proceedings need to conclude, but often when an investigation is going on, FERC will defer or move more slowly on other areas while they wait for a particular issue to get resolved through administrative proceeding. This seems to suggest that FERC isn't waiting for AD 17. Now, the other question is this new, these two orders, do they establish kind of the inability of RTOs to retain a resource that they need as a almost definition of failure of the tariff that requires a prompt remedy? Making tariff changes within 60 days is a very fast process. Normally the process in RTO, ISO wholesale markets is several months, 6 months, a year, year and a half sometimes to make these tariff changes. ordering them on a 60-day schedule suggests that FERC is seeking very prompt resolution and prompt remedies. Another question these orders raise is FERC creating a new reliability criteria called fuel security that can trigger these out-of-market payments to resources that create a reliability violation if they propose to retire. Existing reliability criteria are related to resource adequacy that can't be delivered through transmission problems. And if there is a transmission problem, while that transmission issue is being addressed, resources that are needed for reliability can be retained with cost of service agreements. It's a well-established mechanism that the FERC has implemented on numerous occasions in different areas. These orders suggest that there's a new criteria that's going to have that same level of impact as the traditional transmission constrained reliability concerns. And the fourth question that I've put up here for people to consider and be happy to talk about is the FERC intentionally trying to encourage what we call a residual capacity model for RTOs, similar to MISO's capacity construct. Both PJM and New England have a, I call a full requirements capacity model. All resources must purchase their capacity through the relevant capacity market in either New England or PJM. MISO allows resources to identify contracts or arrangements they have to provide resources, and they only have to purchase residual amounts or offer excess amounts in a secondary kind of capacity market auction that occurs once a year. So with that, I'll conclude and turn it over to Max, who's going to do a presentation on a more local issue similar, related to reliability and resilience.
Thanks, Paul. I am going to talk about, whereas Paul is focusing on market constructs and generation issues, generation reliability and resiliency, I'm going to talk about what New Jersey has done in the last few years, specifically the electric distribution companies of New Jersey, how they have responded to the Board of Public Utilities in New Jersey to address sort of major storm events that have occurred in New Jersey. Sharing.
Max is just going to get the PowerPoint up and running.
Sorry about that.
There we go.
Okay. Back to New Jersey.
We're just trying to get the slideshow for you. There we go.
Sorry about that. So, like I said, I'm going to talk about how sort of New Jersey responded to sort of several major events that occurred in 2011 and 2012, how the BPU, the Board of Public Utilities, addressed sort of the response that they sort of formulated, how the electric distribution companies responded to the board's orders and directives, and some additional regulations that are now applicable to the electric distribution companies. To set some background, here's a map of New Jersey with the 4 major electric distribution companies in the state. PSE&G, I'll use acronyms, so Public Service Electric and Gas, PSE&G has 2.2 million customers. Jersey Central Power and Light, JCP&L, has 1.1 million. Atlantic City Electric, which is in the southern part of the state, has about 530,000 customers. and Rockland Electric Company, RICO, which is in the northern, northern part of the state, with 71,000 customers. So many of you will probably remember 2011 and 2012 as certainly in the Northeast and especially in the Mid-Atlantic as being several major storms. First was Hurricane Irene, which was August of 2011. And on the map of New Jersey, it sort of shows the rainfall from Hurricane Irene. And then in the table in the corner, it shows the number of sort of customers that were out during that particular event. The next storm to hit just within a few months was an October snowstorm, which occurred with sort of while there were still leaves on the trees, so that just exacerbated issues, causing lots of tree limbs and tree damage. That one impacted, you can see on that, for that event, that impacted New Jersey quite a bit as well, mostly in RICO and central part of the state. And then finally, Superstorm Sandy, which occurred a year later, in October 2012. That was a superstorm, that hurricane event. You can see that 91% of PSEG's 2.2 million customers experienced outages. Public Service Electric and Gas reported 152 million hours of outages. So on average, each customer was out for about 3 days just from that one event. So clearly, these were three major events all occurring within a 14-month period. This was quite a bit of a concern for the Board of Public Utilities and obviously ratepayers. So in response to the storms, and in fact, right after Hurricane Irene, the Board of Public Utilities initiated a docket to sort of address major events. And as they were going through this process, Superstorm Sandy hit. So in January 23rd of 2013, the board issued an order, sort of a major storm order, and basically this order of about 60 pages covered sort of 5 major categories of major event responses and efforts. One was preparedness efforts, 2 was communication, 3 restoration response, 4 sort of post-event response, and then 5 was sort of underlying infrastructure issues. The underlying infrastructure issues then sort of resulted in another docket with a subsequent order very shortly in March, and that order established the procedural process for the board to review electric distribution companies and actually natural gas distribution companies' major event mitigation efforts. One thing to note during this timeline was that in February of 2013, Public Service Electric and Gas filed a petition for its Energy Strong proposal. And the next slide, I'll go into more details about that specific petition. In the sort of intervening years, as sort of electric distribution companies and natural gas distribution companies have filed sort of either major event mitigation proposals, and as these proposals have gone through either a settlement process or an adjudicated process, New Jersey has also undertaken a revision of sort of the regulations applying to the electric distribution companies. One was a major change in the vegetation management statute. This requires additional tree clearing for all electric distribution companies, and this statute was effective as of 2016. Another major statute is this last one. This one establishes a procedural process for distribution companies to file additional infrastructure investments. This is a brand new statute. There is currently one electric distribution company that has filed a petition, and that's an active docket currently. Back to sort of what the electric distribution companies have filed thus far. The first one, obviously, after Superstorm Sandy was Public Service Electric and Gas. In their initial filing, they sought a petition to implement a $1.7 billion program over 5 years. This was sort of 20 programs and covered, you can see on this table, sort of 20 different individual programs of differing investment sizes and effort. This was filed in the beginning of 2013 and actually was settled in March of 2014. So this 13 to 14 month period, there was a lot of discovery. There's testimony, several rounds of testimony. There was ultimately a settlement in this docket, and what was settled was at least on the electric side, a much more narrowly focused program that covered 3 specific areas. The largest was substation investments to address substations that were flooded or damaged during either Hurricane Irene or Superstorm Sandy. This one covered 29 substations. It was originally for $420 million, and the company was also allowed to spend an additional $200 million through base rates. The second program was advanced technologies. This was sort of a lot of distribution automation, a lot of smart switches, a lot of automation to help manage the distribution system to respond to both major events and to just for blue sky day-to-day reliability. The third program was contingency reconfiguration. This was to help critical infrastructure such as hospitals, fire stations, police stations in order to sort of beef up the distribution systems or distribution feeders serving those critical infrastructure areas, and to either make them harden or to sort of make redundancies so that they could mitigate or respond better to major events. This slide sort of shows the damage to one particular substation, C. Warren substation. The slide on the left shows sort of seawater inundation. This is where the storm surge flooded the control room, and you can see the clear sort of corrosion line. The second slide is after the Energy Strong program. This is one of the raise and rebuild substations. So essentially, PSE&G went through a number of substations and raised and rebuilt control rooms and sort of switch gears. And you can see the red line, it shows the stormwater mark. And what the utility did was to raise the substation by the FEMA flood level plus a foot. And you can see the sort of the effort involved in that process. After Energy Strong, RICO came and filed a petition in 2015 to sort of address their storm hardening initiative. Their original filing was for $61 million, and they basically sought a number of programs listed on the left. And again, through a process of discovery, discussions with the company and with staff, there ultimately was a settlement for $15.7 million, and again, a much more narrow focused program specifically on feeder enhancements, flood wall barrier, limited undergrounding of a particular circuit, distribution automation investments, and a 3-year completion cycle. And then in 2016, Atlantic City came in with a proposal for $176 million across approximately 15 programs, again through a discovery process and negotiations with the company and with board staff. A much more narrowly focused program was actually agreed upon for approximately $79 million, and again across 6 programs, again focusing on hardening, a little more undergrounding, addressing some barrier island feeders, additional distribution automation spending, electric fusing, and a new substation, and a 5-year completion. The main takeaways from these 3 particular programs, there are several. For the public service electric and gas, the largest one by far, one of the requirements of the settlement process was the hiring of an independent monitor who actually reported both to staff and to our client, who was rate counsel. The independent monitor actually participated in all of public service electric and gas's sort of weekly meetings on the project, and sort of was a on-site eyes and ears for the project. And while there were, to be fair, there were issues, but also to be fair, the independent monitor had a very important role to play just by having that additional layer of transparency through the process. This ultimately resulted in an on-time delivery of virtually all the projects and some project savings, most notably in the substation program, through the process of monitoring and changes during the implementation of the substation mitigation project. Approximately $133 million, their company is coming in under budget, which is a good thing. And specifically with the substation investments, one of the things note on this particular program was that at the onset of this whole process, when we discussed with the company, they were very resistant to the idea of actually eliminating individual substations. But through the sort of implementation process, eventually 8 substations were either retired or just removed from the program. So it goes to show that through a diligent process of reviewing the utility plans, asking lots of questions, in addition having an independent monitoring available, I think you can ultimately get modifications in the program that will benefit ratepayers, especially for ratepayer-funded programs, such as the ones being implemented in the state of New Jersey. One of the additional factors, one last factor that we observed was through the Energy Strong process, we formulated some metrics of how to report success of the program. And one of those metrics was utilizing a 5-year rolling average of CAIDI, which is Customer Average Interruption Duration Index. It's a measurement of how long individual customers experience an outage, if they experience an outage. And the thought there was that a 5-year average would account for major events that we knew would occur in the future, since one of the things we acknowledged from the process was that while these investments would help mitigate major events and improve response and reduce outage durations, they would not completely eliminate any outages from major events. So we knew that we wanted to see the improvements, but we knew that we wouldn't be able to see complete elimination of outages. So one of the things that has happened is that, fortunately for the state, they really haven't experienced a major event like Sandy or Irene, and hopefully they will avoid those, but because it's a rolling average, the average now looks sort of much worse because there haven't been any major events, and the 5-year average now has sort of excluded Superstorm Sandy. So those are some takeaways from what New Jersey has done, and I'll turn it back to Jen to open it up for questions.
Thank you very much, Paul and Max. Great presentations and lots of information for questions. So I will start. I have a few for Paul and a few for Max, and then I think we have some overarching questions that maybe both of you can interact on. And I will start with Paul. Paul, can you describe, there were 2 terms in your presentation that I just want to make sure that are fully clear for all the participants. One is minimum offer price rules, and the other is fixed resource requirement alternative. Can you describe how both of those work?
Yeah, the minimum offer price rule, it's been developed in slightly different ways in different regions of the country, but it applies in both PJM and New England. The theory behind the minimum offer price rule is to try to create a level playing field for resources, particularly in the capacity markets, where resources bid in 3 to 4 years in advance at a particular price. The price they bid in is supposed to reflect their long-term recovery needs for the life of the resource, over however long they think the resource is going to last. That price would obviously be quite different if someone was getting a specific revenue stream available only to that resource and no other resource. And this is most commonly raised, the minimum offer price rule, originally with the impact of solar and wind resources that were receiving various state either rebates or credits, and also some federal production tax credits, and that this would create an unfair advantage for these wind and solar resources. So the ISOs, through their market monitors, the folks who monitor all the bids into the markets, developed these kind of a price screen, which said for this type of resource, here's the minimum offer that you can offer into the capacity market. You can offer higher than that, your cost may be higher, but you can't go below this because we've determined that that is the lowest fair offer that you could make based on the cost of your resource, and the attempt is to exclude or nullify the effects of the special revenues or the subsidies. New England has had a lot of mitigation, minimum offer price rules in effect for many different types of resources. PJM, as I think I said in the slides, currently only has it for gas-fired utilities because that was the only resource that they thought would be potentially clearing as a new resource in the auction. Now, the problem with PJM is some of these subsidies are now being applied to existing resources, some existing nuclear plants, existing coal plants, and it is allowing those resources to offer into the PJ market at a below, what some people consider a below market price, distorting the capacity market, and this is believed to be unfair for other resources that want to compete with them. It's a very contentious issue. There's a lot of different economists who have different opinions about what a minimum offer price rule does, how extensive it needs to be, whether it's really needed at all. But FERC seems to have decided pretty clearly that they want to see minimum offer price rules in effect for all resources in an effort to try to make a level playing field in the capacity markets administered by PJM in New England. The other question you asked, Jen, was about the fixed resource requirement. I think I talked about this a little bit. The fixed resource requirement was developed years ago in PJM to address new entities. PJM has expanded a lot in the last 10, 15 years, and when a new entity came in, they had a choice of fully participating in the capacity market or not participating at all in the capacity market. AEP selected this FRR option for 5 years and then since has abandoned it, and now they're fully in the market. What FERC said in the June 29th order to PJM was you should develop something similar to this that called an FRR alternative that individual resources can claim, so that an individual resource can say, I do not want to be considered a capacity resource, take on a capacity obligation. However, I will be supplying X amount of energy throughout the year, and the thought would be that PJM could subtract that capacity need from the market as well as the actual energy that's being provided and net that out. And this, over time, could start to look like just a residual capacity auction with everyone moving to this FRR alternative and only buying or selling small increments in PJM's capacity auction. This is why some people are concerned that these FERC actions, both in PJM and New England, may show a shift in FERC policy that in the past had seemed to wholeheartedly endorse wholesale market efforts, and now there seem to be some concerns that these wholesale markets may not be as effective as we thought at delivering resources that are needed, and we should develop some other alternatives to just the forward capacity market. I'll leave it at that, but take any other questions that people might have.
Thank you, Paul. That was very helpful. Appreciate it. A question or two from Max. You talked a bit about, well, you went into a lot of detail actually about various proposals and settlements. Are these approaches that can be replicated in other states?
The simple answer is yes, but I think what we've really sort of learned from these particular cases was that there is an asymmetry of information. Clearly, the utilities understand their systems and will propose what they think is best for the system. So for stakeholders, it's really important to find consultants, or not to plug for ourselves, but certainly to find, to ask questions, to ask lots of questions, and to really sort of dive in and understand how these proposed programs work, how they would benefit the distribution system, both for major events and, more importantly, for blue sky reliability, just day-to-day operations. There's a clear benefit to some of these programs on day-to-day operations, and while you're designing them for sort of the 1 in 100-year event or 1 in 500-year event, it's important for stakeholders to try to gain the sort of most value out of these investments as possible.
And I appreciate you talking about asymmetry, because I think, you know, we're seeing really the beginning of a number of different efforts at a number of different levels. So, Paul, you raised RTOs, ISOs, and FERC. And Max, you talked more about states. There's also cities as well. You know, where are the interconnections here? Where is the coordination? Are there opportunities to coordinate more? Because certainly resiliency at all these different levels could be defined differently, and different actors see resiliency in different ways.
I'll take a first shot at this, and then let Max respond. Where I see the connection is basically an economic cost. How much should we be spending to avoid losing the electric grid? Now, I don't think the answer is spend up to infinity, because we can't afford that. And certainly no one wants to not spend an extra $100,000 if that's what it would take to prevent the grid from going down. Transmission reliability concerns have evolved over decades. There's a lot of mechanisms that are used to evaluate transmission system reliability. We have what's generally called a 1 day in 10 standard. In other words, you do not want to have a loss of load event, unplanned loss of load event, any more frequently than once a day in 10 years. There are no parameters around this resiliency issue in terms of what is an acceptable level of loss of load. Should we be planning for only losing load once every 20 years, once every 50 years? And any of those answers can be right, but there's a huge price tag associated with expanding reliability to these larger levels. And that's the concern at the wholesale level, is that FERC is kind of just pushing forward saying we want resiliency and reliability they almost seem to be saying at any cost, or whatever the cost seems to be. And the difficulty here is to try to come up with mechanisms or models or criteria or principles that would say we need reliability up to this certain level, but if we actually have, 10 days in the winter where it's 30 below zero, that's not a failure of the electric system. That's an extremely unusual winter event that will probably never be repeated again in 100 years. And we may lose the system. I'm not going to try to suggest what that standard should be, but I think that's where the discussion and debate is at what level of reliability or resiliency should we plan for and spend money to attain.
And it certainly seems like, it certainly seems like a continuum, certainly as you think about it from hardening and restoration to fuel security, but then you also have longer-term mitigation and ultimately the potential for retirement and relocation if you really are looking far enough out.
Yeah, I would actually say that Paul's response applies to the distribution system. Certainly in the case of how New Jersey has responded to those events in 2011 and 2012. There clearly is certainly if you did what the utilities wanted to do, that would be one approach, and whether or not that would be a reasonable response, that was sort of open to question. And while I don't think the board ever decided on what was an acceptable level of reliability and resiliency, certainly the settlement the agreed settlements sort of provide some level of improved reliability and resiliency, but certainly not to the extent and not to either the effort or the cost that was originally proposed by the distribution company. So I agree with Paul that it is an economic question, and it is a question of what ratepayers are willing to pay and willing to bear to see improved reliability. I think we all would agree that improved reliability is a good thing, but at what cost?
Okay, great. I'd like to shift gears a little bit. And so I think it was Paul's presentation, there was the notion that nuclear and coal might be protected or preserved in some way through FERC, and I think we're seeing certainly, well, actually Max had raised, emergency generators in his proposal as well. So I have two questions, two different ways of thinking about that. One is, how important is it to think about feedback loops? I mean, in many cases, resiliency has to do with changes in our climate, and so to what extent are we implementing solutions that exacerbate the problem? But also, to what extent is preserving nuclear and coal generation disruptive in terms of the processes that have already been set up at FERC and through the ISOs? And I don't know, Paul, you want to start out from a FERC perspective.
Yeah, the way I would approach that question is that the way we generate and produce electricity is going through a huge transformation. I don't want to sound overly dramatic, but I think it's pretty significant shift. There's a greater awareness that traditional fossil fuel generation is probably making climate change issues a little more difficult to deal with than if there was less fossil fuel generation. And many states have wholeheartedly endorsed that idea, and they're making progress and taking steps to shift their generation to more renewable resources, resources that do not emit greenhouse gases. Many of those resources are variable resources. They operate when the sun's out. They operate when the wind is blowing. They operate when water is flowing, hydro resources. The challenge is how to handle that variability while we're transitioning away from traditional resources. And those traditional resources have been coal-fired, nuclear-fired, gas-fired, some oil-fired generation, and some large hydroelectric projects. Those are the major sources of traditional electricity. And retaining those units past their economic life may be necessary in some situations to preserve reliability, but we don't want to be stuck forever with, old, inefficient, uneconomic units when there's new resources out there trying to get into the system, trying to get onto the grid, trying to provide energy. So finding that balance, I think, is a real challenge, and it varies a little bit from region to region in the country, but I think every region faces a certain flavor or different flavor of this kind of challenge, and if they're not in the midst of it today, they may be in the midst of it in the next 5 years.
To sort of turn the question on the distribution side, certainly not specifically part of New Jersey's response, but certainly the grid modernization programs are initiatives in a number of states are sort of helping evolve the distribution system to A, meet resiliency, and B, sort of integrate renewables. The distribution automation investments that New Jersey has undertaken, certainly as they apply to sort of improving sensors on the distribution system, improving switching devices, sort of responding to low voltage, those help day-to-day reliability, and they actually could help integrate additional renewables. So those types of investments certainly can sort of address multiple objectives, and I think those types of investments are how distribution companies are sort of also evolving to respond to climate change.
Great. We have about 5 more minutes, so I'll ask one more question, then we can wrap up. I want to just hear from both of you, all these investments, will they prevent outages? Because we certainly saw in Max's presentation, Superstorm Sandy and PSE&G's territory, 91% customers out. Does this mean if we invest a lot of money that we're going to be able to bring that down to 0? What's the appropriate level? What are we designing for?
Well, I can talk about the distribution system. Certainly the storm initiatives, the energy storm initiatives, they're not going to eliminate all outages. I mentioned in my presentation that the intent was to help mitigate and sort of improve outage duration. So certainly one of the things that we have asked the utilities to provide is sort of how they respond to sort of major events like thunderstorms or snowstorms, and how those investments have performed in relation to more generic major events as opposed to the sort of extraordinary major events. And what we've seen in the data is that certainly those circuits that have had investments have seen improvements in their interruption durations, so that there is an improvement. It doesn't eliminate it completely, but certainly it is better than it has been before.
Paul, do you have any follow-up on that?
Yeah, I agree with Max entirely that it's the distribution level. You're going to continue to see periodic outages, hopefully on a small scale basis, because it's just the nature of the electric system that it's vulnerable to things like trees falling down or high winds and things like that. From a wholesale perspective, I think the effort is to make sure that the grid overall is reliable and able to move power around, so that whenever outages do occur, whether related to storms or other reasons, that they're kept small and manageable, and they don't become systemic and start cascading, within a particular grid system, or worst of all, from one grid system to another grid system. We've seen that occasionally happen over the last 20 or 30 years, not very often. But you will never, as an individual customer, as an individual person using power, you will probably always have certain outages that happen just because of the nature of the system, and that's not a failure of the system. That's the way we've built it up. It is a lot of miles of wires, and if a wire goes down, someone is probably out of service. The goal is to try to keep those outages as small duration and affecting as small a number of customers as possible.
Great. Thank you very much, Paul. Thanks again to Paul and Max for presenting with us today. And a few things to wrap up. If we didn't get to your question, we will follow up with you after this presentation is over, this webinar is over. Our next webinar is Thursday, August 16th at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Right now we are looking for topics, so if you have ideas, please feel free to email them to us at webinar@synapse-energy.com. And we'll send out the recording and the slide deck from this webinar shortly after we conclude. Thank you very much, everybody, and have a great afternoon.